8830 Idaho. Interview Series. Stephen Snow. Interviewed by Jeremy Maxon.
Hello, my name is Jeremy Maxon. I'm the Executive Director of the Living Independence Network Corporation in Boise, Idaho. And I'm joined this morning by Stephen Snow, who's the Director of the Idaho Council on the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. And we're doing one of a series of interviews as part of the 30th year anniversary celebration of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And this interview is, like I said, a number of interviews that we're doing with community leaders who may or may not have disabilities, who have been part of the disability rights movement in Idaho and around the country. And we're going to be talking about Stephen's experience and some of the things that the council has going on in Idaho, and some of the great work that Stephen and his crew is doing to support folks in Idaho who are deaf or hard of hearing. So welcome, Stephen. This is exciting to be here with you and to have an opportunity to talk with you.
Wonderful. It's my pleasure to be here.
So I want to just jump right into it and learn a little bit for folks who are watching about who you are. You were born in Idaho in Gooding, and you went to the Gooding School, which I want to talk a little bit about. But I'm really curious what your background is, what your family story is. Were you born and raised in Gooding or some other part of the state? Tell us a little bit about who you are and what you're about and what it was like growing up in Idaho.
Well, certainly. Thank you for asking. I'm happy to share with you my background. So I did grow up here in Idaho. I was actually born in California, in Northern California, and when I was about 6 months old, my family moved to Idaho. So even though I was born in California, I still consider myself a native, since I was so young when we moved here. So honestly, I have no roots left in California. I truly am a native in Idaho. So we moved to Gooding, Idaho, and that is where the Idaho School for the Deaf and Blind is. So that's where I went to school. And as you've probably guessed, I am deaf myself. I am the 4th generation deaf person in my family. I have an older brother who is also deaf. And with that, when I say deaf, I also mean that I am culturally deaf, which means I use sign language and I use it as an identity. My father and the generations before that probably would have considered themselves hard of hearing. They didn't use sign language, but they did have a hearing loss. I identify myself as a deaf person, and I don't see that as something in a negative light. I see it just as something different. I am who I am, and I just communicate a little differently than other people. I grew up at the School for the Deaf, and upon graduation, I wanted to get my life started, and I wanted to go to college. So I don't really see being deaf as changing my life course, because I think that's always how I was meant to be. My parents always treated me equally. I have a brother who's deaf, and then I also have a few siblings who can hear. And honestly, we never felt that we were treated less than my other siblings. Honestly, I feel that we perhaps were maybe treated a little better in a way. But fortunately, my family all knew sign language. Some of them knew it better than others, but we knew enough to communicate. My mom was very fluent in sign language, and my dad was less fluent, but he did know some signs. And part of that was because my dad was the one who was the breadwinner who would go to work, and my mom was the one who stayed home. So she was the one who mostly communicated with my brother and I. So I would say that that's my background in a nutshell. Oh, and before I forget to add also, I should also talk about my family now. My wife is also deaf. I met her at the School for the Deaf and Blind. We have 4 children, and people often ask me when I tell them that I have 4 children if they're deaf or hearing. And I say, well, they're culturally deaf, but they're medically hearing.
Mm-hmm. little bit, if you will, just briefly about the school in Gooding. I think a lot of folks know that it's there, but I don't know that a lot of folks have experience with it or I mean, they don't know what it's like to attend a school like that. I'm sure it's not different than a lot of schools, but just kind of curious what that experience was like. And you said you met your wife there. Do you still have a lot of lifelong relationships with folks that you went to school there? And do you see them around? Are they still in Idaho? Share a little bit about that.
Yes, that's a great question. I honestly would not be the same person I am today if I didn't attend for the School for the Deaf. I would say that that helped develop my level of confidence because I was so involved with student body government, with sports and other clubs and activities. That really helped me develop who I am today, and I really do owe that to the School for the Deaf. If I had attended a public school with other individuals who could hear, I honestly don't think I would have had the same experience. I think I would have felt really isolated and I wouldn't have the friends that I did. So I honestly do attribute my success to the foundation that was built at the School for the Deaf. One unique feature about the School for the Deaf is everyone communicates in sign language. At the School for the Deaf, there are two different tracks. There is one track that includes overnight lodging for students to stay in a cottage there, similar to dorms. And then there was another track for students who lived nearby. And those students didn't stay in the cottages, but they stayed home and attended school just during the day. So I was fortunate enough to live really close to the school. So I was able to stay at my house with my family every day, just as if a person were going to a public school. Fortunately, whether someone stayed in the cottages or lived close by, we felt that we were equally treated by the teachers, and they really invested into our lives. I was able to be involved in so much when I was at the school. I was able to be involved in the sports. I was able to be involved in leadership and student body government. And I also had several deaf role models who were teachers. I was able to look up to people who were like me. And obviously, I met my wife at the school. So without the school, I never would have met her.
That definitely makes it all worth it.
Yes, definitely.
So tell us a little bit about, you graduated from the Gooding School, and then you had to make a decision, I guess, to go to college. And that can be a terrifying, just as someone without a disability or barriers from a disability, that can be a frightening experience. Where did you choose to go to school and why? And what were some of the concerns or stresses that you had taking that leap to go from Gooding, Idaho to maybe a bigger city with a lot of change and a lot of people and a lot of unknowns?
So that's a great question. So once I graduated high school, before I went to college, I actually served a 2-year mission in England. So that was completely different. Growing up in a very small town to moving to a completely different continent, that was quite a different experience. I was in London for quite a while when I was in England, so that was a new experience. I was also on my own for the first time. I had to learn to fend for myself and take care of myself. So it really helped me develop my independence. So once I completed my 2-year mission, then it was the point that I decided that I needed to get out there and go to college. And because I had had that 2-year experience, honestly, I didn't feel very homesick. So I felt that it wouldn't be a problem to go to a place that was far away. So as I mentioned, I grew up in Gooding, Idaho. And fortunately, I grew up in this bubble that was of sign language where I didn't have any issues with communication. I was able to communicate directly with my teachers who used sign language. I had a few friends who attended the School for the Deaf who also attended school at Gooding High School, so they would use a sign language interpreter. And they honestly felt some barriers with that because they couldn't speak directly to their teachers. Mm-hmm. So when I then looked at my choices for college, I wanted to have a similar experience. I wanted to be able to communicate with people. I did decide to visit a university that was in Utah because I had a deaf friend that was there, and he encouraged me to come check it out. I remember going to visit one class, and I attended a class with my friend, and we were sitting kind of further back in this large lecture hall. And mind you, this was a university of students who could hear, so it was just my friend and I that were deaf. I remember during that lecture experience, my friend and I tried to ask a question, but we realized that the teacher, possibly because we were using an interpreter, didn't want to call on us. So I looked at that situation and realized that I was missing a lot of discussion and interaction because people didn't use sign language there, and I would have had to go through a sign language interpreter. I felt so disconnected because I had to keep my eyes on the interpreter during the whole class instead of being able to see my peers. So from that point on, I decided to visit Gallaudet University. So fortunately, my brother, who's also deaf, was already there. So I decided to visit Gallaudet, which is a university that is for deaf individuals. I went on that trip and I was so fascinated by the environment. Again, similar to the School for the Deaf, everyone used sign language. So I could fully participate in my education. So that's why I decided to go to Gallaudet, and that's in Washington, D.C. And it is the only deaf university in the world. I honestly didn't have any qualms about it because it felt like a second home to me. So I graduated there with my bachelor's and master's degree, and then I actually ended up working there for several years. That really, truly became my second home. I loved that everyone that I was involved with was just like me, and I honestly have no regrets for my experience.
I can't even imagine what that would be like. Using a manual wheelchair, and if you ever go to an event or a conference or you're in a space where it's predominantly people who use wheelchairs or have challenges with mobility in one way or the other, it doesn't get to communication, but just culturally, socially, to be in that space where the norm is changed, and you look like everybody else, you function like everybody else. It's just a total game changer. And so I can't even imagine what it would have been like to be on a campus and have an experience on the communication front, which is so critical to culture and friendships and learning. So that's amazing. That school sounds incredible. And the research that I've done on it, it looks like a beautiful school and an incredible school. And one thing I want to talk to you about that school is the movement that happened around the hiring of a president who I believe wasn't deaf. And there was somewhat of an uprising of the student body to demand that the university hire a deaf administrator, I believe, or president. And so can you talk a little bit about that, especially since it was in the context of right before the passage of the ADA, essentially, around 1988. And so there was a lot happening, I think, in a lot of places, but this is a kind of a unique story, and it's interesting, and I'm wondering if you can share with us a little bit about that.
Yes, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So that happened in 1988. It was the spring semester. At that time, I was actually still a student in Gooding at the School for the Deaf. But my brother was there, and he was very involved with the movement, which was called Deaf President Now. And at the School for the Deaf in Gooding, there were some other students who also had siblings at Gallaudet, like I did. So we kind of got firsthand information. Gallaudet University at the time was also encouraging schools for the deaf across the country to join in the movement. So my brother, his name is David, actually called me At that time, we had to use what was called a TTY, which was similar to texting through a landline. So my brother explained the movement and asked if there would be a way that I could get involved at the School for the Blind, or Deaf and Blind in Gooding, to get students involved in the movement. So I, of course, obliged, and I said that we definitely would host our own walkout at the School for the Deaf and Blind in Gooding. So we were very excited about the way the country was moving with that. But I do have to say that that was definitely a first for Gooding. We really hadn't had protests in the past. Many students were fearful of retaliation and of what that would mean if we did decide to walk out. So I was able to recruit some of the students and told them all about the protest that's happening at Gallaudet University. And at the time, we decided to host an emergency meeting. Or excuse me, the superintendent decided to host an emergency meeting. And he said that if any students participated in the walkout, that they would be expelled. So we definitely, that definitely weeded out a lot of students. So there were really only about 3 or 4 of us that were actually willing to stand up and walk out. So we had planned this, but last minute we decided that it probably wasn't the best idea. So we decided not to do our own walkout. But we definitely watched what was happening in Gallaudet on the news, and I was getting a lot of firsthand information from my brother. It was at that point that I realized that this really is an issue, not only at Gallaudet University, but it's a problem nationwide of not having deaf individuals involved in leadership. I realized that this was about our rights and about our access as deaf individuals, and that we were being limited by administration. So this encouraged me and really sparked a flame to fight for rights and to ensure that deaf people have those rights. So, and that really all stemmed from that protest at Gallaudet University.
So you graduated, you worked at Gallaudet for a while, and then what did you do?
Yes, that's a great question. So I loved the environment at Gallaudet. I loved working with the students and the faculty and staff. I no longer felt that I was labeled as being deaf. I just felt human because I was around other individuals who were. It wasn't until I left the campus that I remembered that label that I was deaf, because I could no longer communicate with people. I then had to use other strategies of writing back and forth or gesturing. And it wasn't until I went back into the bubble at Gallaudet that I really felt that I was just human. And with Gallaudet being the only deaf university in the world, there are a lot of people across the world that look up to that and would like to have that same environment. So I felt so fortunate to be in that reality that it really was a mini deaf world. And I knew that when I left that safe place that I would face a lot of challenges and that I would face a lot of discrimination. So because of that, I stayed there for many years and I worked there for several years. I was very fortunate, even though I was able to be hired there and worked on the staff for several years. But it was at that point that I realized, looking around at my environment, that if I really wanted to make change for deaf individuals, I had to leave that safe place. I do believe that what I learned at Gallaudet University helped make me a better advocate for myself and for others.
Gallaudet is so interesting to me. The only thing else, the last thing I'll say is when I was looking up how to pronounce Gallaudet, because it could be tricky to pronounce the way it's spelled. I looked on the Gallaudet Facebook page to see if I could track a video down of someone pronouncing Gallaudet, and of course, none of the videos have audio really. There's music, but it's all sign and it's all closed captioning. And so I was really struggling to like figure out how to pronounce it. I had to go on the internet and Google it. But it drove home how unique that environment must be to have it completely tailored to communication in a way that we're not used to.
Right.
I'm not used to.
Yes. Yeah. And how to pronounce it
Great.
really is not important to us.
Yeah, it was really fantastic. Okay, so there's more to talk about. You ended up in DC and doing some work and living in Washington, DC. And what brought you to DC, and what time was this, and how long were you there, and what were you doing?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I had two jobs while I was at Gallaudet University. I was an academic advisor. So primarily I worked with students who were undeclared majors. And in that, I was able to provide them guidance and provide them with career assessments that would help them realize what their unique capabilities are and help them then to create that career choice and to pick a major at Gallaudet University. I was also a faculty member in the Communication Studies department. And my specialty was in public speaking. And in my opinion, public speaking is such a pertinent skill to have. It is a way to show someone's skills and their knowledge. It is the vessel in which they do that. So I enjoyed that because I was able to help the community find their voice and be able to communicate their ideas and their skills. So I worked there in Washington, D.C. at Gallaudet for 8 years.
Okay. And you were on a number of committees, I guess was my question, a number of policy committees and things like that. And talk a little bit about that work.
So you mean at Gallaudet? I was the committees there? Certainly. The first leadership activity that I participated in as a student was when I was a senior, and I was the director of deaf-related issues department. And honestly, even though Gallaudet is a great place, there still are barriers. There still are instances of discrimination, just as there is any place else. So fortunately, definitely not as many as in other places, but with that, I was involved with student body government. And within that, there were several cabinets, and one of them was the director of the Deaf Student Issues Department. And this position doesn't necessarily have a lot of involvement in campus, but does have some. For example, in that position, I was involved in the Student Senate, and I was able to be involved in those discussions on policies. And at that time, when I was serving as the director of that department, we also were hosting the Deaf President Now anniversary celebration. So while I was there, we celebrated the 10-year anniversary. So with that, I was able to coordinate a team to be able to celebrate that movement. So that's a very proud moment for me, to be able to look back at something that was a success in our community and to be able to celebrate it 10 years later. So that was my first experience in leadership at Gallaudet. Additionally, as a faculty member, I was involved in several task force and committees, one being the university governance. So I was able to be involved in that. I was also involved with the university financial committee for budgetary reasons. So with that, I was able to be involved in several committees to ensure that we met the credentials needed to receive an endorsement. I was also a part of the Technical Access Committee at Gallaudet University, and I was also involved in a committee for individuals who had a secondary disability, such as those who are deaf and blind or deaf and have autism and so on. So I was involved in that committee to ensure that all students were receiving the things that they needed to receive their education. So with those students who have a secondary disability, it does require extra attention to ensure that they have access to meet all of their needs.
Yeah.
So those are just a few of the committees that I was involved in.
Okay. Talk a little bit about, and then I want to talk about 9/11, because that's an interesting story that I think is important and interesting for people to hear. But before we get to that, talk about what you saw or what your experience was with the passage of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Being at Gallaudet University, it was unique in the sense that you were kind of...
Well, you know, I wish that I was at Gallaudet when it passed, but unfortunately I was not.
No, you were there afterwards. And so it was
Right.
being a university that is so accommodating for folks who are deaf or hard of hearing, could you tell the changes that were created by the ADA, even though it was early on? What did you experience? What did you see? How did life change after the passage of the ADA for you?
Yes, that's a great question. So the ADA was passed while I was in high school. And I remember at that time, a group of students and I actually wrote a letter to our congressman about the Americans with Disabilities Act. I wish that I could find a copy of that letter now, but I'm sure we had some great points in that letter. But some students and I came together and we discussed that, and we decided that we wanted to get involved how we could. So we developed discussion points, and then we drafted that letter and sent it to a few of our congressmen. So with that letter, that was my first experience being involved in any type of government. And from then on, I was able to write other letters to our state body government. But I like to look back on that letter because it was really my first step into that, the first time I really dipped my toes into something like that. And I'm not sure if that letter actually helped pass the Americans with Disabilities Act, if it had any impact, but I felt like it was our way of contributing to the movement. And at Gallaudet University, prior to the Americans with Disabilities Act, something that was different, if I wanted to be able to call home, so if I wanted to call to my mom, or if I wanted to call my doctor's office, I had no way of really doing that well. Honestly, I had to depend on family to interpret for me. So if I had to go to the doctor, my mom would come with me and she would interpret for me. So, and honestly, that was the way that it was at that time. So I didn't really think much of it, but now looking back, I realize how huge of an impact the Americans with Disabilities had on my life in that aspect. And honestly, because my mom was my interpreter for so much of my life, my knowledge of my medical history, my access to that appointments was limited. So I would say that fortunately through high school, I went to the School for the Deaf and Blind, so I had access to sign language. So I didn't really feel the impact of the Americans with Disabilities Act then. It wasn't until I really got out into the real world that I felt that impact. And really, the Americans with Disabilities Act has truly changed our lives.
So talk a little bit about 9/11. I've heard of this story. I've not heard the story. I think, that's a powerful day for everybody who lived through that. But I'm really curious, and we're hoping that you could share your experience being in Washington, D.C. on 9/11 and what that was like and how that shaped your perspective on the whole world of emergency preparedness and emergency response, which is something that the disability community is really, really active in, particularly right now with COVID-19. And I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit about what that experience was like and what you learned from that.
Yes, absolutely. honestly, I remember 9/11 like it happened yesterday, like I'm sure many people feel. I remember so many details so vividly. And honestly, this could be an hour-long discussion about my experience, but I'll try to keep it short for our viewers. At that time, I was working at Gallaudet University, and I remember when it happened, when the plane hit the Pentagon. And I was an academic advisor at the time. Within that building, we have a lobby that was just around the corner. And I had someone come out of that lobby and tell me that there was a plane that struck one of the towers in New York. And honestly, we looked at the news and we thought it was an accident. I think everyone did. It wasn't until the second plane hit that we realized that this was intentional. Information is shared fairly quickly in what we would call the mainstream, or with individuals who can hear. But honestly, deaf individuals are often the last people to know what's going on. We were in the lobby looking at the TV, but of course there weren't closed captions on, so we didn't know what was going on. It wasn't until an individual who could hear, who signed, who came into the room, who told us what was going on. And at that point, that was when students were finally getting the true information of what was going on. At that point, after the plane hit the Pentagon and we realized that information, we thought, how long has it been that everyone else knows what's going on and we don't? When we're, not very far away from this event, and we're still just finding out about this event. I remember going up to the top of a dorm room, to the top floor, one of the tallest buildings on campus, and we were seeing everything happening, and we looked over from the direction of the Pentagon and we could see the smoke coming up from that, and we just felt so out of the loop. We didn't know if there were more planes coming or if we were in danger there. Unfortunately, Gallaudet did have some emergency preparedness, but definitely not enough for a situation like that. It honestly felt like we were all running around almost like chickens with our heads cut off for a while, because we just didn't have the information that we needed to feel like we could prepare ourselves for that and be safe for that. A while later, leadership finally came together and got students in cars and started evacuating campus. Unfortunately, because of the chaos of the city, many of the roads were blocked off. And at that point, we didn't have texting. So we were in these cars trying to get away from campus with no direction of where to go or exactly what to expect next. So that was definitely a life-altering experience. It really brought my mind to emergency preparedness and how important it is not to just have a general plan, but to have details and specifics in your plan. It's not good enough just to say, oh, if an emergency happens, we will do this and we'll make it through. We hadn't foreseen that something like that would happen on 9/11, but it's important to be able to be prepared for that. Unfortunately, there were a few deaf individuals who worked at the World Trade Center and a few that worked at the Pentagon who lost their lives. Well, in the Pentagon, fortunately, there was, when the plane hit, the deaf individual was able to get out, but they had no communication. They had no idea what was going on and no one else who knew sign language. So unfortunately, many deaf individuals in the community felt so left out of the loop. They were able to see what was going on TV, but without the sound, there were so many holes in the information they were receiving. They didn't know exactly what was going on. So from that, Gallaudet University formed an emergency preparedness committee to ensure that deaf individuals had access if something like that happened again. So creating committees like that has definitely created more peace of mind. It's very unfortunate that in 9/11 we did lose some deaf and hard of hearing community members.
Yeah, that was a frightening time all around, and it's hard to imagine experiencing that and not having access to the information about what was happening, even though that information was not always accurate. It was frightening. Thank you for sharing that. And it would be it'd be an interesting topic to talk about in more detail at some point. So you moved from DC back to Idaho in 2008, I believe it was.
Yes, 2008.
And you were hired as the director of the Council for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing. What was that like, coming back to Idaho in that role? And what have your priorities been? And what are some successes that you're really proud of, and that have helped folks in Idaho who are deaf or hard of hearing?
Oh, yes. Honestly, when I told my friends in DC that I was moving back to Idaho, my friends thought I was crazy. They said, why in the world would you want to move to the middle of nowhere, Idaho? Gallaudet has everything you would ever want or need. So it definitely was a difficult decision. At Gallaudet University, I was a small fish in a very large pond. So people asked me the question if I felt like I made a difference when I was in Washington, D.C. And I would say that I definitely did make a difference in some students' lives, but I cannot look back and say that I made integral changes that had a large impact on the community there. But when the job became available in Idaho, I had friends and family back here in Idaho that were encouraging me to come back. So I really gave it a lot of thought. And I knew that I wanted to continue to improve my experience with the legislature. I wanted to be able to work with state legislators, and I didn't have that experience thus far. So when the position became available, and I noticed that it would require a lot of work with the state legislature, I thought, if I moved to Idaho, I could truly make a big difference, an integral difference for the deaf and hard of hearing community. So that's when I decided, even though I loved Washington, D.C., and I loved my experience there, I knew that I needed to leave that space in order to make an impact. I did know, however, when I moved to Idaho, outside of that safe place of Gallaudet, that I would face a lot of barriers and a lot of discrimination. Now looking back, I have no regrets about my choice to move back to Idaho. It was in this position here at the Council for the Deaf and Hard of Hearing that I began to make an impact, but it was really the first time in my life that I experienced discrimination and barriers. Like I said, growing up at the School for the Deaf and Blind, everyone used sign language, so there wasn't that barrier of communication. And when I was at Gallaudet, everyone used sign language, so my work was always in my first language. And when I moved here, it definitely was a change. And it took quite a long time for me to work through those barriers. But through my work at the council and with my team at the council, now looking back, I see the difference we're making, the difference in policy and the difference in the culture here in Idaho. The one that I'm probably the most proud of is the interpreter license law. Myself, along with my team here and with the community, we spent many, many years drafting something that would require interpreters to be licensed. So having that be passed and knowing that there now is a standard for interpreters in Idaho is something that I'm very proud of. I feel so fortunate that I made that decision, and I honestly hope that more leaders from Gallaudet will leave that safe space and create changes like that in other areas across the country. Even though I loved Gallaudet, I truly believe my home is here in Idaho.
I feel like you were definitely meant to come back here and do what you're doing. The experience at the school in Gooding and Gallaudet, it seems like the only way that we can make advances is when people have their expectations set higher. And your expectations in Gooding and in DC were set really high. I mean, you had access to a lot of resources and were immersed in a culture and an environment where you could thrive. And it seems like leaving that environment and coming outside of those bubbles, your expectations were higher, and you felt that you deserved to participate like everybody else. And so I think that being immersed in those environments was really the catalyst to push change forward. Because otherwise people, if you don't have high expectations, then you aren't motivated to create change. And maybe you could speak to that a little bit.
Yes, definitely. I would say that the environment from the School for the Deaf and Blind and also Gallaudet definitely increased my confidence. Being in an environment where I didn't experience communication barriers, where I was around deaf role models, allowed me to develop that confidence in myself to be able to then give back to the community and to know that I could give back to the community in that way. So it was in those experiences and in those environments that I realized that I was capable, just as anyone else is, with or without a disability. And that I wanted to also encourage other people to realize that they are capable and that they can reach their dreams. And honestly, when I moved from Gallaudet to here in Idaho and worked at the council for the first time, I definitely experienced some frustrations. I went from that environment where I believed that I could do anything to being told, no, you can't do that. Mm-hmm. I was told that I couldn't have a sign language interpreter. And honestly, I attribute my ability to stick with it and my tenacity to my experience at Gallaudet. Instead of just quitting and leaving, I knew that I could stick it out. So I worked here for several years until I finally did receive a staff interpreter. So honestly, I feel that this job has been a great test of my character, but in a good way. It's shown that I am resilient and that I can do things. And I just want to encourage individuals in the community and other individuals with disabilities to look at their lives the same, that they can overcome those barriers. And there are ways to become successful.
Absolutely. I think that's probably a good place for us to end it. It's been about 50 minutes, and this has been a really fascinating conversation and really insightful.
Oh, wow, yes, it's longer than I thought.
Yeah, and I just want to say, as somebody who gets to work with you and your team, you and your folks are incredible, and you are so respected in the community for the work that you do and how you bring these issues forward, and your collaborative spirit and your commitment. And so, as somebody who's working in the disability rights movement, you're definitely a strong leader who people have a lot of respect for and look up to. And I'm really glad you're doing this work in Idaho, and it helps. It encourages me to do better work. So thank you for that. And thank you to Lauren for interpreting. And this has been a great interview. And I want to encourage folks to watch the rest of the series as we post those on social media, and we'll archive those as well if you don't have an opportunity to watch those during the ADA celebration. And thank you for joining us. Thank you, Steve. And we'll catch all of you on the next interview.
All right, thank you so much, Jeremy.
Image description: a word collage in the shape of the United States with the word access highlighted and hashtag thanks to the ADA.